Hello, this is Matt from Heaney Apps, and this is part 6 in our Introduction to SwiftUI series. In this video, we will continue to take a look at using data in a SwiftUI app, and we will take a look at using observable objects. To learn about this, we will make this app here, an app to show a score from a pretend football game. Here it will show the number of minutes in the game, which we will control with this slider, and we can give each team a goal. So we have some code to do, let's get to work. So into Xcode, and we will hit create a new Xcode project. This will be an iOS app, which we are going to call Observable Objects. Make sure the interface is SwiftUI, the lifecycle is SwiftUI app, the language is Swift, hit next, and save it up somewhere nice and safe. Once Xcode has kicked in for you, let's hit resume on our preview, and once you can see the hello world in your preview, we are all ready to go. So, as I said, in this video, we'll take a look at observable objects. In the last video, we took a look at state and binding, where we can mark a property with a state property wrapper, which will allow us to update that value, and it will make SwiftUI redraw our views so that any view that is bound to that property will update, keeping everything nicely in sync. The state property wrapper is an incredible tool for simple bits of data, and data that is owned by the view that it's used in. For example, a simple string that is owned and used by one single view will be a perfect case for a state property wrapper. But as your apps grow, you will likely start to use classes to encapsulate some data and the functionality to modify this data. In these situations, the state property wrapper isn't really the best tool. This is where observable objects come into play. With observable objects, we can use classes for our data, but we can still tell SwiftUI that we want the view to update when the value of certain properties change. So our views can be bound to the data in this class and that everything stays up to date. So let's see this in action and you will see exactly what I mean. So for this, what we're going to do, we're going to make a brand new class that will handle all of the data and all of the logic for a fake football game, or a fake soccer game if you will. This class will handle keeping track of the game time and keeping track of the score. We will then use this class to show all of the information about this game that we're tracking in our view. We will then turn this into an observable object so that when something happens in the game, the data will get updated and our view will update to reflect this change. So for this, we will start by making a brand new class. This class will be our football game live score tracker. This class will handle having all of the data that we care about our game of football, and it will have some functionality that will update the score. So let's make a brand new class. So let's for today keep this in the same file. So let's drop below our content view preview, and let's make a brand new class, which we will call football game live score tracker. So now let's add the properties that we care about. We need a game time. This will be a double because we want this to work with a slider, but when we display it, it will act like an int. We care about the name of the home team. So it's a constant called home team name, and we will just give this a hard-coded value for today. The home team is going to be Matt Heaney Apps United. And we care about their score. So home team score, which will start at 0. And we also care about an away team. So let away team name. This is going to be Alice FC, and they will also have a score. So away team score is going to equal 0. The game will start at 0-0. So this is all of the data that we care about in our game. We also want some logic in here. So the two bits of logic that we really care about is adding a goal for the home team and adding a goal for the away team. So what we do, let's add a brand new method in our class called home team goal. No parameters, and this will take the home team score and it'll add 1 to it. And we need a method for away team goal, where we can add 1 to the away team. So now we have a pretty simple class which will hold and it will track all of the information that we care about our game of football. It will also handle the logic to update the data in our game. We now want to use this from our content view. So let's jump back up to our content view and let's put our view together. For this, what we'll do outside of the body, we will create a brand new instance of football game live score tracker, which we will call game. Now this object here, game, will be one of these objects from down here. It will keep track of all that information about the game, and it will allow us to access that functionality to update the home team goal and the away team goal. It's just a normal class. Let's hit resume on our preview, and then into the body, let's get rid of our text object because we have no need for that anymore. So let's put together our view. For this, as you may remember from the start of this video, it'll be a couple of text objects on top of each other with a slider down the bottom. So for this, we'll need a V-stack. For this, I want everything aligned over to the left, so let's add an alignment of leading. So up first, we will have a text object, which is going to say today's live game. This will be bold, a bit of a bigger font. So for this, we will use a system font of a size of about 30. I'm going to add a bit of vertical padding to this to give it a little bit of breathing room of about 2. Our next text object will show the home team name and the home team current score. So brand new text object, and this is going to make use of our game object. So we will do some string interpolation to show the property in the game, which is the home team name with a colon and then the home team score. Same thing for the away team. Underneath this, we want to make use of our game time object, which will show how many minutes into the game we are. So yet again, another text object, which will say game time. This is going to show an int version of game time from the game object. We want this to be a lot smaller because we want it to be a lot more subtle because it's not the most important bit of information in our view. So a new font of a system font, size of 12. Let's make it grey. Again, with a bit more vertical padding on this to give it a little bit of breathing room. Just like so, just a padding of 2, just to give it that little bit of breathing room. Now we also want to have 2 buttons, one to add a goal to the home team and one to add a goal to the away team. So let's add a divider to separate this bit of information from the rest. And because the divider will take the whole width, our view will now take the entire width. So we want a button that is going to say home team goal. And the action for the button, it will go to our game object and it will run the method home team goal to add 1 to the home team. Sweet, on to the next item. A button for the away team goal. And let's add some padding to our whole V-stack to bring this out from being tucked up right to the side of the screen. So on the V-stack, a bit of padding of horizontal padding of about 30. That is looking much better. We will also have to add a slider to this in a minute, but we have a few other bits to set up first, so we'll come back to the slider in just one moment. So we now have our main view set up and we have our main class set up, which is handling all of that information that we need. The problem is, if we was to run this and try to use this app in the way that it is now, it won't really work. Let's check that out. What we will do, we will hit the live preview button on our preview over here. Now we know that if we hit the home team goal button, it's going to run the method which will add 1 to our home team goal. Here we would expect our score here to update, and we'd expect Matt Heaney Apps United to go 1 up. Nothing's happening. The thing is, the score is actually being updated, but our view just isn't staying in sync. Now we learned last time that we need to add a state property wrapper to a property that we know will update. But because all this information is being handled in a class, things are a little bit different. What we have to do, we have to tell SwiftUI that our class, this football game live score tracker, is an object that we have to observe. We have to watch it for changes, and if anything does change, then SwiftUI has to redraw this view so the latest data about our game of football is shown, so everything stays in sync. So how can we do that? What we will do, we will say that this is an observable object, like so. What we also have to do is add a property wrapper to the properties that we know will change, and that when they do change, we want the view to update. This, rather than at state, is going to be at published. And we're going to add these to all of the properties that we want to keep an eye on. In our case, it'll be the game time, which we will handle in just 1 second with that slider, the home team score and the away team score. This tells SwiftUI that whenever any of these values change, to re-render the views that are showing them so everything stays in sync. But there's just one more thing that we have to handle. Not only do we have to make this object an observable object and mark the properties that we care about with this publish property wrapper, when we create this object in our view, so this here, what we also have to do is mark this as an observed object. And just like that, this object is now observed within the view. With these changes, our app will now work as expected. So let's hit play on our preview. And now if we hit home team goal, we're going to fire that method to add 1 to the home team goals, and this will be shown in our text. So now we have used an observable object to sync up our data which is being used in a class. To recap, we have made our football game live score tracker an observable object. And we have marked certain properties, the ones that we know will change and the ones that we know that when they do change we want our view to update, with this published property wrapper. Then when we've used this class, we've made this an observed object, so this view will look out for these values, and when anything is published, so when any of these important bits of data change, the view will update to reflect this data. Now this looks very simple, and to me that's the beauty of this, because it is very simple, but under the hood something pretty advanced is actually happening. Here we're actually using something from the Combine framework, a framework that is used to listen out for data changes. This published property wrapper is actually doing quite a lot of work, and to see exactly what it's doing, what we would do, we're going to set this up the manual way, so we can see exactly what published is doing. So for this, first things first, we have to import Combine into our file so we can use all of the very cool tools that come with this framework. Then what we would do, we will get rid of the published property wrapper on one of these objects. Let's do this on home team score. And we will set this up manually. Now when we make this class an observable object, we're actually getting an extra property underneath the hood. This property is the object will change observable object publisher. And this is a brand new instance of Observable Object Publisher. This here is going to be almost the middleman between us publishing changes from this class and our view picking up on these changes. When we mark the football game live score tracker as an observed object, we're in a way subscribing to this object. This will send out updates to the view to tell it that something has changed. Then from the class, when one of these properties actually change, it needs to tell our object will change publisher. How that works under the hood is with a did set block. So we're going to add these curly brackets after a property and add a did set block in here. Now whenever this changes, this block here is going to run. And all that does is tell our object will change that something's changed, and to send out that notification to anything observing this object. So now whenever this property changes, it's going to tell our object will change that something has changed. This in turn will tell our game instance up here in the content view that something has changed, so our view will know to update. Content view is now listening to changes from this object here, and when a property is set, it will tell that object that something has changed. But the beauty of this published property wrapper is that we haven't got to do any of that. In fact, we don't need to import the Combine framework. We don't need to be handling this object will change property, and we don't need all of these did set blocks. By adding that published property wrapper, all of that is handled for us. Pretty cool, right? It might be worth noting that even though most of the time you'll probably just use the published property wrapper, understanding how it works is actually a really important skill to have, because understanding how it works will give you that little bit more control when you need it. Say for example, you want to have a view which listens out to a change on a property in a class, but you only wanted to update on certain conditions. In that did set block, you can get all that control. You probably won't use the full method there too often, but keep that in the back of your mind just in case it comes into play one day. So that all now in place, we have our binding set up between our view and an observable object, where we can now update our score. But this is of course a form of one-way binding. These text objects here are simply reading that value and displaying it in a text object. However, observable objects also support two-way binding. To see this in action, we can now finally set up our slider, which will set how long has passed in the game. We couldn't do this before we made this object an observable object, so that's why I left it right to the end. So into the body of our content view, so underneath the button, let's add a brand new slider. This is going to be form a two-way binding to the game time property in the game object. Because this is two-way binding, we will have our $sign. The range is going to be 0 to 90. There's 90 minutes in a football game, and the step will be set to 1, so we can drag this along and set the number of minutes that have passed in our game. This here will now use our game time property in the game object with two-way binding. The slider will be able to set this value, and if we wanted to, it will be able to read this value. Before we see this in action, let's polish this off just a little bit, as I want the slider down the bottom of the screen. So let's add a spacer between the button and the slider, but that will make our football score information bump all the way to the top of the screen, which I don't really want. So let's add one more spacer above the top text object to bump this back down. Finally, let's add some padding to the bottom of our slider, just because it looks far too low for my liking. So padding on the bottom of about 10. And there we go. So now the slider, in the exact same way that we saw in the state and binding video, can work with an object from our observed object with a form of two-way binding. And the big teller here that is two-way binding is our $sign that is sat before the property. Now we can set the value of game time from our slider, and this will update our text, which says game time 0. And let's throw a little dash there, just to make it look like game time is a certain number of minutes. But let's hit play and let's check it out. We're gonna add some goals in, and we can drag that slider, which will write to the game time property, which is displayed in our game time text here. And just like that, we have now made our class object a fully observable object with both one-way and two-way forms of binding. And we're now handling all of that information about today's football game in a class, but our view is updating to stay in sync and to reflect any changes. One more note that I really quickly wanted to point out: if you wanted to have one of these views as a custom view and you wanted to pass the observable object down into that custom view, nothing new or fancy in this case. In that custom view, just mark that property as another observed object and it will all work the same. In the state and binding video, we looked at having to use the binding property wrapper in custom views, but that isn't the case for observable objects. All you have to do is mark that property in your custom view as another observed object. Now, before we wrap this up, I know Alice is just as competitive as I am, and if I don't make her win, I'm going to get told off. So let's make that a 3-2 win. And that is going to wrap up this video. And that will wrap up our look at observable objects. As always, leave any questions or any comments down in the comment sections. It's been pretty quiet down there lately, so post something down there, even if you're just saying hey. If you liked watching this video, which I really hope you did, make sure to hit that like button, hit subscribe, ring that bell to stay notified, and thank you for watching this video. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.